All right, so thanks for coming to part 2. Let's try to recap what we discussed yesterday. So basically, we mentioned that during and right after the Great War, there was a mathematical war between the British and the German to develop a new theory of lift. So there were two competing theories, one in England and one in Germany. The British theory was the discontinuity theory of lift, led by Lord Rayleigh, which interestingly started in Germany first. And there is the circulation theory of lift by Kutta and Prandtl, which interestingly was started in England first by Lanchester, right? And we provided a comparison between these theories. So here is the Newtonian. This is the lift variation with the angle of attack. This is the Newtonian theory in red, the sine square law. The blue is discontinuity theory of lift by Lord Rayleigh. And black is the circulation theory of lift that we currently teach throughout the world to our undergrads, which is a reasonable approximation to what is happening in reality. As you can see, the Newtonian theory and Rayleigh's theory, they underestimate the lift quite significantly. In fact, if they were to be correct, aviation wouldn't be possible, right? So the interesting part is that the circulation theory of lift actually starts first in England by one of their countrymen, Lanchester. And they rejected it, they made fun of him, they mocked him. So let's try to recap their objection to the circulation theory of lift. So this is Taylor Adams Bryce say, Mr. Lanchester loses the possibility of generating the motion from a state of rest by a movement of the solid. In searching for an explanation of the forces which act on solids moving through fluids, it is useless to confine one's attention to irrotational motion. As we discussed yesterday, basically he's saying if you start from rest, and so at rest you have irrotational flow, no flow actually, which is irrotational. So if you have an ideal flow, a state of irrotational motion will remain irrotational. So you lose the possibility of generating forces from rest, which is the prevalent mindset in the British academic community at the time, and I would say it's still nowadays, pretty common. He did not change his time after the war. This is in his Wright Memorial Lecture. The ordinary hydrodynamical theory, meaning ideal flow, potential flow, is therefore quite inapplicable to the case of bodies moving steadily through the air. One must seek for the explanation of the forces that are observed in these cases in the action of the eddying region of the flow, which is not surprising. Taylor was looking for a theory of turbulence, for turbulent flow. Bairstow, who was a very strong opponent to Lanchester, used to mock him and made fun of him. When he wrote his book, Applied Aerodynamics, he wrote, "It appears to be fundamentally impossible to represent the motion accurately by any theory relating to an inviscid fluid." Cowley and Levy's book, even if we accept the assumption of ideal flow, it can be shown that this force, lift force, is proportional to the intensity of the cyclic motion, gamma, and is thus apparently quite arbitrary, because your ideal fluid dynamics cannot tell anything about the value of gamma. And they concluded that the failure of the various treatments of the problem is evidently due to the supposition that the fluid is perfect, right? So they are asking for a viscous theory that will clarify at one stroke the whole problem of aerodynamics. And like I mentioned yesterday, more than 100 years after these words, and still we're not any closer to this general theory that accounts for viscosity and everything. So if we want to summarize the points of objection of the British school, they saw lift is purely viscous. There is no hope for any theory that relies on ideal fluid concept to be useful for lift. So we need to solve the Navier-Stokes equation. For them, ideal fluid theory is quite futile. It's fruitless. In the words of Melville Jones, one of the professors in aeronautics at Cambridge, it was regarded purely as an exercise for the amusement of students. Like we mentioned yesterday, it's material for examination boards, not for serious research. The research interests at the time had grown to, the adult problems of viscous flow, for turbulent flows. This is the classical stuff of ideal aerodynamics is not of interest anymore. And even if we accept the ideal fluid concept, gamma is arbitrary. We have no means to determine gamma, and the invention that you guys came up with, which is the Kutta condition that handles the case in a special case, is not derived from first principles. It's just an ad hoc condition, empirical condition. And it handles it in just one case, assuming that the trailing edge is sharp, and in reality, our trailing edge is never mathematically sharp. It will always have, some roundedness. So these are really a list of objections by the British school. So what made them accept the theory at the end? What happened? Well, right after the war, they put their hands on the technical work happening at Germany. This actually happened on a massive scale, much larger scale, more systematic scale after World War II. You can read about it, Paperclip Project or Operation Paperclip. But on a smaller scale, it happened after World War I. Actually, this is a letter from Ames of NASA, from the headquarters to Hanskar at the Navy. He's saying that the importance of the information contained in the secret technical reports in Germany cannot be overestimated. And it is the desire of the committee, NASA, that all research laboratories and individuals interested in aeronautical research should become familiar with the results of the aeronautical research carried on in Germany during the war. These reports included very valuable information. So a turning point in the history of the theory of lift happened when Glauert and Wood from England, they were assigned to go to Germany, Gottingen in particular, meet Prandtl to report on the activities happening at Gottingen Institute at the time. So Hermann Glauert was, he's an Englishman. He was born to a German father. And his mother was an English woman who had born in Germany. So he had some affinity to Germany. In fact, when he went and met Prandtl, they spoke in German. Prandtl didn't know English. So perhaps this played a major role in making him, more closely acquainted with the theory, with Prandtl's statements. He was intrigued by Prandtl's idea, and when he came back to England, he took it upon his shoulders to convey Prandtl's ideas to the British community. So right after going back, like less than a month after his visit to Prandtl, he published the first report under the name Aerofoil Theory, trying to say like this: the theoretical formula may be accepted as giving a reasonably accurate method of predicting the biplane characteristics from those of the monoplane. He's basically saying it really captures lift and drag in a reasonably good way. So his next report was, okay, what about, so it's okay for lift and drag. What about the detailed flow pictures? So his next report is addressing this. The theory predicted the flow field now details with a reasonable accuracy. Luckily, Glauert was not the only one trying to push. So there was Major Archibald Lowe. He was a practical man, practical engineer who built and designed the Vickers airplane. He was invited to give a talk at the Royal Aeronautical Society meeting in 1923. And he stated the following: Lanchester had shown remarkable insight into the physics of a problem that had baffled scientists of the last century. Had our physicists followed up his ideas, this country might have shared in the work. So he's basically blaming the British community of ignoring Lanchester. So Bairstow was among the audience. He was the chair, actually. He was the one invited Lowe. So he said, yeah, it's okay. It's a very good empirical theory. So he's trying to hint that it's not a fundamental theory, not based on first principles. It's just working. And he was something like, I'm surprised that the speaker spent the entire lecture without mentioning a fundamental property of air on which its motion depends, viscosity. So he added, Stokes' equations were sufficient to account for the phenomena, whether it was a steady flow or an eddying flow. These equations did not appear in the Prandtl theory. Again, he's blaming Prandtl theory that it didn't come from first principles. It was not deduced from the governing equations. So Lowe did not let it go. He responded, I have no objection to providing scientists with endowments and facilities to allow them to pursue their strictly abstract studies. But who knows when, if ever, these studies will bear fruit. As an engineer, I do not intend to wait for them on this occasion. And he was, 100% correct. Again, we're more than 100 years, exactly 100 years after this date, and we're no closer to solve Navier-Stokes equations on a real airplane. So Glauert continued his efforts, and he knew that, okay, it's not now, there is a difference in the mindset. I need to change their mindset. I need to change how they think about the way to solve a fluid mechanics problem. So he wrote this paper, which was a conceptual paper. It has much less mathematics, more on conceptual thinking, like what are the main assumptions, the governing equations, how we should think about them. In Bloor's words, the British aeronautical academic community did not need to be convinced of the mathematics. They knew the mathematics very well. They needed to understand the mathematics in a different way. And this is what Glauert aimed to achieve through this paper. So he wrote, this is Glauert. It appears that no satisfactory solution of an aerodynamic problem is to be expected when the effects of compressibility and viscosity are neglected. So he's actually conceding, he's confirming what they are saying, right? He's conceding from the beginning. But it is known that the solution obtained by ignoring viscosity is unsatisfactory. Okay, I'm going to accept this. But it is by no means obvious that the limiting solution obtained as the viscosity tends to zero is the same as the solution for zero viscosity. So he's trying to play the role of a mediator between the two camps. We have the German camp who they neglect viscosity altogether. And we have the British camp who see the viscosity as an essential property of air. So he's playing in the middle. He's saying, okay, I'm not going to ignore viscosity altogether. I'm going to have a viscous solution, but take viscosity, the limit as viscosity goes to zero. And he is making this difference between the solution with viscosity is strictly zero and taking the viscosity to zero. Actually, this is an open problem in mathematics until today, But anyway, so he is following the layer around the body in which viscosity is of importance. This is the boundary layer, right? Can be conceived as of zero thickness in the limit. And this conception is equivalent to allowing slip on the surface of the body. It appears, therefore, that the non-viscous equations will be the same as the limit of the viscous equations. So, yeah, this is the idea that we know nowadays very clear in our undergrads and, 230A and 230B courses that, it's Prandtl idea, right? The viscosity is limited to a small layer around the body. This is the boundary layer, and as viscosity gets smaller, the thickness of the layer gets smaller. So if the viscosity goes to zero, the thickness of the layer will go to zero. So he's saying, okay, I'm going to have viscosity, so I should have a boundary layer, but of zero thickness, all right? So he's trying to play the role of a mediator between the two. So perhaps another, maybe more important turning point happening in this International Air Congress in London, 1923, particularly in this morning session, Wednesday, June 27, so which was chaired by Glazebrook. If you remember from last time, he was the chair of the committee, the advisory committee for aeronautics, like our NASA here. So in that session, they had 3 talks, back to back, Bairstow, Glauert, and Lowe. Bairstow, as usual, stressing the importance of Navier-Stokes. The range of these equations covers all those problems in which viscosity and compressibility are taken into account, and from them should follow all the consequences, which we know as lift, drag, etc., by mathematical argument and without recourse to experiment. Such a theory is fundamental. So he is seeking a general theory, basically a theory of everything for fluid mechanics kind of thing. So interestingly, actually, Bairstow did not deny the success of Prandtl's theory. I mean, it's already working. He did not deny the success. He said, it was those very successes that constituted the problem. The question is, why does circulation theory apply with a sufficient degree of approximation in some cases, and what is the fundamental criterion of its applicability? It's not supposed to work. How come it is working? This is his question. So Glauert started his talk in a completely different style than Bairstow. So Bairstow was seeking a general theory that accounts for compressibility, viscosity, a theory of everything. Glauert was starting his talk with an engineering style. I'm focusing on a specific problem. I'm focusing on airfoils that produce large lift at small angle of attack at the expense of small drag. These are the airfoils, the shapes that are relevant to aviation. And for these airfoils, the effect of the evanescent viscosity is represented in the non-viscous solution by the possibility of a circulation around the airfoil. And look at his use of the word evanescent viscosity. Evanescent means, like passing quickly from sight or memory. Interestingly, the word evanescent was used by Newton when he referred to infinitesimals. To Newton, infinitesimals were evanescent quantities. They are quantities that are neither zero nor finite. They are on the very verge of vanishing. This is evanescent. Interestingly, Bloor recalled actually that Bishop Berkeley made fun of Newton, when he came up with this expression of evanescent quantities. So even Newton was mocked up. So he said, may we not call them the ghosts of departed quantities? So luckily, Glauert was lucky, really, that Bairstow did not know about this, criticism of Newton. Otherwise, he would have made fun of Glauert, saying something like evanescent viscosity is the ghost of a departed boundary layer kind of thing. So in conclusion, Glauert concluded as follows. He was saying, evanescent viscosity, it's not strictly zero, but is on the very verge of being zero. This is what he's trying to say. Taking the limit as viscosity goes to zero in an expressive way. So basically, he was trying to answer this question. So why ideal fluid theory works? Well, it works when the ideal flow is a limiting case of a real flow of a fluid of small viscosity. Basically, this is what his idea, Glauert. Then the third talk by Major Law. He was using the circulation theory of lift to apply it on the Albatros wing. Albatros, not the bird. It's actually one aircraft, German aircraft during World War I. He started his talk by reminding the audience that the German circulation theory actually appeared in England first. So he said, 50 years ago, Rayleigh had published his paper on the spin of the tennis ball and explained the force that made it veer by reference to the circulation. We discussed this yesterday. And then he added, Lanchester had boldly applied the idea of circulation to the wings of an aircraft and had given a thorough descriptive account on the mechanism of flight. And then he said the following. Had Rayleigh put forward the theory, how we should vied with each other in the will to believe it, if not in power to understand it. But when it was offered by a man outside the circle of recognized physicists, it was ignored. So this was punch in the face to the British community listening in front of him. And he actually concluded his talk at the end saying, in conclusion, it is desired to call attention to the fact that this fundamental physical theory, look at this, fundamental physical theory, he's really making a contrast against Bairstow, who called it, an empirical theory. A fundamental physical theory was first stated by an English writer and then allowed to fall into complete neglect in the country of its origin, largely owing to the attitude taken up by some of Lanchester's fellow members of the Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. Can't be clearer than this, right? So that was a hard push from Major Law and from Glauert. So the committee, Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, had to respond immediately. In fact, within less than a week from that meeting, they made a formal decision that the investigation of the airflow behind aerofoils of finite and infinite span be carried out to ascertain how far the Prandtl theory can be substantiated by experiment. Okay, let's investigate. We cannot let this go now. Which was, performed by two main experiments. One by Bryant and Williams. So they made an experiment for a tunnel spanning wing, two-dimensional section, at an angle of attack 10 degrees. they measured the velocity field at many points in the domain so that we can have contours, many contours, you know, and we know the velocity field, so we can get gamma circulation around these contours. Some of these contours enclose the wing, some of these contours do not enclose the wing, all right? Glauert, you know, took this data immediately and produced his report, just in November the same year. And he started by saying, well, 10 degrees angle of attack, this is quite large value. The theory is not expected to work in this, you know. But let's see. So he considered the contours over the airfoil, all the contours that enclose the wing, all right? And compute their gamma circulation. And he found that gamma is independent of the contour. So if this is your wing, here is one contour that they had, this green one. Here is another contour, the purple contour. Here is a third contour, the orange one. And here is the fourth, the blue one. He computed gamma for all these contours from experimental measurements, and he found all these gammas the same. So gamma is independent of contour. That's a fact of an irrotational flow, right? This is potential flow by definition, right? So not only that, the value of these gammas, any one of them, because they are close to each other, it actually satisfies this equation. So they measure the left-hand pressure difference, and the measured gamma, measured left, satisfies this equation. So when he saw this result, it was very happy result for him. So he hastened to publish it without even looking at the rest of the data. This did not convince Taylor, who responded very quickly, actually, within 2 months. And he wrote a report under the name Notes on the Prandtl Theory. This is, to him, was like, this is crazy. This is 10 degrees angle of attack. There is significant wake and considerable drag. The flow can by no means be irrotational. There is something fishy going on. If these are the results that you guys found, then it must be by coincidence. He wrote, Mr. Glauert's result would have to be attributed to a fortunate choice of his contour rather than an irrotational type of flow. And he started to look for the special type of contours, such that when you get their gammas and plug them here, they satisfy this equation, whether or not the flow is irrotational. All right, just by coincidence, accidentally. And he found these contours. If you have your wing, two-dimensional wing, at high angle of attack, you have the wake, this red wake, all right? If you choose your contour such that it crosses the red wake in a way that is parallel to the direction of the lift, the gamma of this green contour will satisfy this equation whether or not the flow is irrotational. So he said, if Mr. Glauert's circuits are in fact chosen in this manner, his result, though interesting in itself, cannot be regarded as being in any sense confirmatory of Prandtl's fundamental hypothesis that the motion at a great distance from the airfoil is irrotational. He did not know what the contours look like in Glauert analysis. You know, he was just guessing. And if we ask the question where the contours really look like this, you can see. Unfortunately, yes. So this was like punch in the face from Taylor to Glauert. However, 2 years later, when Bryant and Williams brought all their data in a formal paper, a full paper, 1926, Taylor actually converted his notes into an appendix to that paper. And in that appendix, his tone was very different. Why is that? Because here is the picture of the flow field. This is from the paper 1926. So these dashed lines are the contours that I showed to you, the orange contour, the green contour, the blue contour, you know. It's not clear here. And the gammas of these contours are here. You can see that all of them have very similar numbers. And all of them, they actually match the number coming from the pressure distribution. All right, so these are the numbers and the contours used by Glauert. But then there are the rest. All these rectangular contours, we have the velocity values for them. So we have the circulation, I mean. The value of the circulation is in the middle. They are all zeros. The flow is indeed irrotational. So this is why Taylor, in his appendix, he said, Bryant and Williams show that the flow around a certain model aerofoil placed in a wind tunnel is not very different from an irrotational flow with circulation. So that was a big statement. Taylor was a giant in the field, so he's conceding basically. And it seems that the circulation theory of lift is now acquiring a larger territory in the British community. Actually, the second experiment was even more interesting. So by Fay and Simons, so they tested a finite wing now, a rectangular wing. Aspect ratio 6 degrees angle of attack. All right? They made a heroic effort to measure the velocity field at many points in 4 planes. One right before the wing, one right after the wing, one like 2 chords length behind the wing, and section D that is not shown here, that is 13 chords behind the wing. They wanted to get a complete and detailed picture of the flow field to test. I mean, now we know that Prandtl theory captures lift and drag in a reasonable way, induced drag. We want to look at the flow details, you know, the flow field itself. They found fingerprint of Prandtl's theory in all these pictures. And here is my favorite one. So Prandtl theory asserts that there is a vortex line, you know, shedding away behind the trailing edge into the wake, right? And these vortex lines, they are actually connected to the bound vortex lines that gives you lift, right? This is actually Lanchester's idea that satisfies Helmholtz's law of vortex dynamics. All right, now, if I go into the wake like this plane C, for example, and I have a contour like this contour C, and I measure the velocity field on that contour, so I can sum it all to get the circulation, gamma, of that contour. By Stokes' theorem, this gamma will give me a measure of the vorticity inside that plane, right? Fine. Now, let's go to that contour C0. This is the mid-span section. I can get gamma of that contour. In general, like setting aside Prandtl's theory, these two contours, C0 and C, are very different, should have any relation to one another, right? It is only when you believe Prandtl theory that the gamma of these two contours should be equal to each other, right? Not only that, the gamma of this contour C0 actually is related to the total lift of the entire wing through Prandtl lifting line theory. So this is what Fay and Simon did. They obtained gamma 0, the circulation of the mid-span section. They obtained it from Prandtl lifting line theory through this relation with the total lift coefficient, which they measured, assuming an elliptic lift distribution. And they compared it versus, or against, the circulation that is coming in the wake from that plane C. And they found it closely matching each other. So that's simply, you know, that's the stand. It can't be better than this. It's not about, you know, capturing lift and drag in a reasonable way. This is very detailed of the flow field, right? That was 1926. In the exact same year, Lanchester was invited to give the Wright Memorial Lecture, receiving the gold medal from the Royal Aeronautical Society. In the very next year, Prandtl was receiving the same honor. And in that lecture, he acknowledged the priority of Lanchester. He wrote, "In England, you refer to it as the Lanchester-Prandtl theory, and quite rightly so, because Lanchester obtained independently an important part of the results. I should like to point out that as a matter of fact, we in Germany were better able to understand Lanchester's book when it appeared than you in England. English scientific men indeed have been reproached for the fact that they paid no attention to the theories expounded by their own countrymen, whereas the Germans studied them closely and derived considerable benefit therefrom. The truth of the matter, however, is that Lanchester's treatment is difficult to follow, since it makes a very great demand on the reader's intuitive perceptions, and only because we had been working on similar lines were we able to grasp Lanchester's meaning at once." The theory was now being accepted, appreciated within the British community, to the fact, you know, to the extent that someone like Taylor, a giant name like Taylor, is sending a letter to Prandtl in 1930 saying, I think you deserve Nobel Prize in Physics. Prandtl responded on November 30 the same year, saying that according to the division of the sciences that is usual in Germany today, mechanics is no longer considered to be part of physics. Rather, it stands as an independent area between mathematics and the engineering sciences. Prandtl is acknowledging the fact that the work that he and his colleagues did is an engineering exercise, is not a physics exercise. So Prandtl, this was his lecture, the Wright Memorial Lecture, under the title, The Generation of Vortices in Fluids of Small Viscosity. He used this opportunity to address two main points that were confusing to the British community against his theory. These were how circulation is developed from rest. You know, the Taylor stuff, you know, how you generate this from rest. It doesn't fly in an ideal fluid. And also, why did the ideal fluid theory work in the first place, right? So he used his theory to address these two questions, used the lecture. So let's talk about the first question. How lift is created or circulation is created in an ideal fluid, because the British thought that this should contradict Kelvin's circulation theorem. Kelvin's circulation theorem states that if you have a contour in an ideal fluid, gamma of that contour is independent of time, is constant with time. So this means that if you have your airfoil, if you take a large contour, right, and at the beginning, at rest, gamma is 0. According to Kelvin theorem, this gamma should remain constant, so it should remain 0. So when your airfoil moves, the fact that this gamma must always be 0 precludes the ability of the airfoil to generate gamma around itself. That's the concept in the British community, and it is still common among many people. Actually, I have a paper, not we, some people published a paper last month stating the exact same thing. So the German mathematicians, they had a different view. They said, no, this is not the case. Actually, we can generate circulation in ideal fluids without contradicting Kelvin's theorem, without violating Kelvin's theorem, very easily, as easy as stirring a coffee spoon in a cup. And actually, this coffee spoon example, you can see it in Safman's book if you want. I'll not go into the details, but I'm just giving you the main idea. Their main conclusion was, we can generate gamma in an ideal fluid, very fine, perfectly fine, without violating Kelvin's theorem. All right? This was Prandtl's main idea, and I'm going to touch upon it in the next slide. Glauert, however, responded in his own way. You know, Glauert is the mediator between the two camps. So this is his book, 1926. And he wrote the following. The process by which the circulation round an airfoil develops as the airfoil starts from rest presents certain theoretical difficulties, what I explained before. Since the process would be impossible in a perfect fluid, again, he's accepting the British concept, you know. It is again necessary to consider the limiting condition as the viscosity tends to 0. So he's playing the same trick again. Owing to the large viscous forces brought into action by the high velocity gradient, a vortex is formed between the trailing edge and the oldest stagnation point. So this is his picture in his own book, 1926. He's basically saying the following. Well, you know, I'm not going to ignore viscosity altogether. Okay? No matter how small your viscosity is, the forces here, the viscous forces near the trailing edge, will be significant and will lead to the generation of this vortex that we know as the starting vortex, right? And now, because this vortex is already generated, go and consider your large contour, like this red contour. Now, for Kelvin theorem to remain satisfied, so gamma is 0 over that contour, there must be a circulation of equal magnitude and opposite direction to this starting vortex. And this is the circulation over the airfoil. So the old enemy, Kelvin theorem, becomes a friend now. Now, you know, before we're saying Kelvin theorem precludes already the ability to generate a circulation. Now we're saying in order for Kelvin theorem to be satisfied, there must be a circulation over the airfoil. But however, during this discussion, he invoked the concept of viscosity here to generate the starting vortex. And this is the common way of explaining how lift is generated in a real fluid with a small viscosity. In most textbooks of nowadays, this is how I explained it in my Unsteady Aerodynamics book, on a real fluid with a small viscosity. Prandtl, however, had a different view. Prandtl's idea was we can generate circulation in a purely ideal fluid, fine, without contradicting Kelvin's theorem. This is, I'm taking a snapshot of his paper in the Wright Memorial Lecture, 1927. He's basically saying every confluence, meaning when the two flows come together at the sharp edge, every confluence at sharp edges can, without contradicting Kelvin's theorem, give rise to a surface distribution of vorticity, a vortex sheet. He's basically saying that when the two flows come together with different speeds, a surface of discontinuity appears between them. And this has nothing to do with viscosity. That's a perfectly legitimate ideal flow concept. All right, so he's saying, this is Prandtl's word, a discontinuous distribution of velocity is set up which effectively constitutes a sheet of intense vorticity. The surface of discontinuity then begins to roll up into a spiral, causing the starting vortex that Glauert was talking about. But he is now, in his discussion, he's saying this doesn't need viscosity. He did not invoke viscosity in this discussion. He's saying it's perfectly fine to have this behavior without viscosity. After he finishes this, explaining how lift or how circulation can develop in a purely ideal fluid, he then moved to what is happening in real fluid with a small viscosity. So he's basically saying, now for a real fluid with small viscosity, we can now see that layers of very small but finite thickness, not zero thickness like the ideal fluid, play the same part which we have already ascribed in the previous section to surfaces of confluence. We now have layers of vorticity instead of surfaces of vorticity. Basically, he's saying this is the case. So he's basically saying that the only role of viscosity is to make the change here from a discontinuous change to a smooth change. Instead of having a zero sheet of vorticity, a zero thickness, here we have a finite thickness. This is exactly Prandtl's words. And he adds, this difference between the two pictures, however, affects but slightly the general behavior of the fluid, so that no serious error will be made if in the case of flow behind sharp edges, viscosity is totally neglected. This is Prandtl's words in 1927. So he concluded, we thus get the unique characteristic that it's precisely these turbulent flows of low resistance around bodies which can be so closely represented by the theory of the perfect fluid. That's Prandtl's conclusion. And, with all these experiments and his deep explanation like this, people had to concede. Even the strongest opponent like Bairstow had to concede. In his book, Applied Hydrodynamics, he wrote this. From a consideration of all available experimental results, it may be concluded that the main effects of finite span can be reproduced by potential flow theory involving trailing vortices. So potential flow theory, ideal flow theory, turns out to be not very bad as we thought. But while conceding, they were not comfortable. So Bairstow actually, in his lecture, 21 Years Progress of Aerodynamic Science, he made this analogy, which is quite interesting. Look at this. Aerodynamic theory is now rather like the physical theory of light. Physicists use the electron theory on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and the wave theory on alternate days. Both have uses, but reconciliation of the two ideas has not yet been achieved. So it is in aeronautics. In our experimental work, we assume that viscosity is an essential property of air. However, the practically useful theory of Prandtl comes from considering air as frictionless or inviscid. I like the analogy between, the particle-wave duality of light and the inviscid viscous duality of air. Actually, he says, it seems that aerodynamics has a future similar to that in electron theory. But this actually reminds us Oh, I'm out of time. So the successful theory of lift, the successful theory of aerodynamics, was based on a false assumption, ignoring an essential property of air, the viscosity. This was commented by Bloor in a very interesting way. He said, progress in aerodynamics thus depended on the triumph of falsity over truth. The successful strategy involved the deliberate use of known falsehoods poised in artful balance with accepted truth. That's correct. So we intentionally made a false assumption, ignoring essential property of air to arrive at a successful theory that we teach to all our undergrads now throughout the world. And this is what Bloor commented as, this is the real enigma of the aerofoil. So he actually, and he said that, this is the very nature of all scientific knowledge, of all theories. Those who point to the airplane as a symbol of the truth of science, the reality of knowledge, are therefore right. The enigma of the aerofoil is the enigma of all knowledge. And that was the last statement of the book. So Bloor made it deep and interesting in this statement, and I totally agree. But frankly speaking, if you think about it in a minute, this is what we do as engineers every day and night, right? This is our job. What is our job? Is to make use of our understanding of the physics of the problem, to identify what are the key factors and what are the not so important factors, to ignore them in order to come up with a mathematical model that is simple enough, doesn't capture everything, but capture the physics that we want. This is exactly our job. And this is why I believe that the answer, Bloor also believes that the answer to the question that why did the British fail in developing a theory of lift while the Germans succeeded? It is simply because Germans placed aerodynamics in the hands of engineers while the British placed aerodynamics in the hands of physicists. So I will bring some comments to explain this idea. For example, here is George Thomson, the son of J.J. Thomson, the Nobel laureate. He is saying, what is perhaps harder for the scientist to realize is the doctrine of good enough. The better is the enemy of the good. This is exactly what Kutta and Prandtl did. This theory is good enough. It allows us to build airplanes, or to design wings at least. For the physicists, no, it ignores an essential property of the air. We need a theory, a complete theory of everything that accounts for viscosity, compressibility. Foppel, the advisor of Prandtl and of his father-in-law, the natural scientist can wait for inspiration or more information, right? Let's wait until we solve Navier-Stokes equation. The engineer, by contrast, is subject to the force of necessity. When some phenomenon interferes itself in his path, he must arrive at a theoretical understanding of it as best he can. And Bloor actually commented very well on this. He's saying, the engineer's commitment to practicality does not mean that fictional concepts have to be shunned. Rather, it is the physicist's commitment to truth that makes such fiction so unpalatable. This is very interesting. So you might think that engineers are practical, so they will shun away from fictitious concepts like ideal fluid concept, right? And physicists are more theoretical, so they will be more tolerant, more accepting to fictitious concepts. On the contrary, actually what happened is the opposite. It was engineers who adopted and accepted the ideal fluid concept. And physicists, they could not accept it. So this is why Bloor was saying the engineering sense of urgency sometimes allowed freedom in accepting assumptions that physicists could not tolerate. In fact, Lanchester himself was saying that the scientist and the engineer were like players in a game of chess who were confronting an opponent called nature. And a sound-looking move might turn out to be a mistake, and an apparent mistake might turn out to be the winning move. This is exactly what happened. From the beginning, ignoring an essential property of the air like viscosity seemed to be a wrong move, a mistake, but turned out to be successful. And we don't know this from the beginning. So this is why, we answered the question this way, and for the answer to be complete, if and only if, we need to ask, okay, what about German physicists? Would they solve it? So they had the goat, right? And they should have made use of him during the war, and indeed they did. So he worked as a consultant to 2 airplane companies during the war, and he came up with a very interesting airfoil, Einstein's cat's back airfoil. Why it's called like this? Because it really looked like the back of a cat in a stretched position. So it's quite interesting. I mean, don't laugh now. We'll have time to laugh later on. But anyway, so this is the interesting point is that they trusted Einstein so much. So they actually built an airplane, one of the LVG airplanes, with this profile as a wing. So the test pilot, and they flew it. The test pilot barely took off the ground, and he came back reporting the airplane flew like a pregnant duck. So it was actually tested. This profile was tested at Gottingen by Munk and Polhausen, among many other airfoil shapes. For the rest of the airfoil shapes, the maximum lift coefficient came out to be between 130 to 140. I don't know how they normalized or defined the CL, but anyway, this was the range. Einstein's airfoil was 95. The maximum lift to drag ratio for all the airfoils were in the range 14 to 15. Einstein's was 10.8. So clearly, it was a poor airfoil. And we do not know how Einstein arrived at this interesting shape, but we can trace it back to his paper in aerodynamics. He actually published a paper in aerodynamics, and you can find it in the collected papers of Albert Einstein, the Berlin years. He tried to answer the ubiquitous question, how lift is generated. And he wrote this in that paper. There is a lot of obscurity surrounding these questions. Indeed, I must confess that I have never encountered a simple answer to them, even in the specialized literature. I don't know what he's talking about. This is 1916 in Germany, the country of Kutta and Prandtl. By that time, they figured it all out, actually. 2D, 3D, boundary layer. Basically, he did not read the literature. And this is a very important from the history of science. Even if you have the brain of Albert Einstein, you need to read literature. So this is his trial to explain lift. We have our wing and the flow coming. So this is like a cambered, right? Okay, airfoil. So he envisioned fictitious walls. So when the air coming, because of the curvature of the air, the area here is smaller. So by continuity, the air has to speed up. And vice versa, the air here has to slow down. And the rest you know, right? So if we have velocity difference, we have pressure difference because of Bernoulli, and then you get the lift, right? So obviously this is not accurate, but it tells you, it may tell you how he arrived at this interesting shape. It seemed that he wanted to maximize this difference, right? So he made this bump, which actually remind me of the comment by Paul Bevilacqua in his last interview at Aerospace America when he was asked, should we really, what is the benefit of a good theory of lift? So he replied, at least it will prevent you from doing crazy things like this. Einstein himself described his participation in aerodynamics as Leichtsinn, meaning it's a foolish act, irresponsible act. And David Bloor, concluded that this episode is a salutary reminder of the difference between fundamental physics and technical mechanics. Eminence in the former does not guarantee competence in the latter, period. Everyone has his own territory, right? So, right. In the story, the German lost the war, right? The actual war. But they won the mathematical war. So, Kutta condition and Prandtl lifting line theory are everywhere, ubiquitous throughout the world. This is what we teach in every aeronautical engineering school. And this morning I made a search on Google on the Kutta condition, and this you can see it's 5 million, lifting line theory 36 million. But perhaps the question is, so they answered the question of the time. Are they really satisfactory? Do they really satisfy the concerns of the British? For example, let's consider the 2D theory by Kutta. We know that it works for a sharp edge airfoil. So what if we don't have a sharp edge like this? well, the entire theory immediately collapses. We don't have a way to compute lift on that shape. Not only that, what if I have a shape like this with multiple sharp edges? So if we apply the Kutta condition, at one edge I will get value for circulation gamma, here I'll get another value. We don't know. Not only that, what about if I have my usual airfoil with a single sharp edge at the back, but in an unsteady flow, a fast maneuver like those done by Maverick in the Top Gun movie? So Martin Kutta never claimed that his condition applies to unsteady flows, and indeed it doesn't. This is Prandtl flow visualization, 1904, and this is an impulsive start, so it's a fast maneuver, and we know that the flow goes around the edge. The Kutta condition doesn't apply, it doesn't work here. And there are tens of papers in the literature criticizing the application of Kutta condition to unsteady flows. Yet the entire theory of unsteady aerodynamics, from the pioneering work of Wagner to Donson, von Karman, and Sears, all the way to the most recent work in the JFM paper, they all adopted the Kutta condition in their unsteady models, because simply there are no alternatives. So what we really teach to our undergrads is a fragile theory of lift. If anything changes in the shape of the wing or the condition of flight, the theory immediately collapses. So the British objections, some of them remain valid on the arbitrariness of gamma. The Kutta condition resolves in only one case. And, in reality, I never have a strictly sharp edge. And it's also not derived from first principles, neither the Kutta condition nor Prandtl. Now, after this story, we can, appreciate why some of the statements made in the books. Like, for example, if you go and open Milner Thompson book, chapter 11, lifting line theory, he wrote this in the preface. The student should be warned that the laws of Prandtl, which will be used as a basis, are not necessarily the laws of nature. He's making this difference, meaning that Prandtl lifting line theory is not derived from first principles. That's just a model based on his intuition. Early on when I was reading this statement, I didn't know what he's talking about. I don't know, what is that? So now we understand, why he is writing this. So let's recap. Rayleigh's rotating cylinder paper, right? The tennis ball paper that we talked about yesterday. Kutta's dissertation, Prandtl bound layer paper, Kutta and Zhikovsky papers on the theory of aerodynamics, laying down the entire foundation. Prandtl lifting line theory, and these efforts were culminated by Prandtl receiving the gold medal, right? The nature of scientific knowledge is as follows. When a new line of research emerges with its own challenges, interests, and cool line, well, we have many people compete trying to get part of the cake, trying to make genuine, fundamental scientific contributions. But then these interests fade with time. During this hustle and bustle of academic activities, many problems were solved, but some of them were not solved. And they remain unsolved. We call them open problems. They remain open for a long time. And sometimes it's interesting when one of these open problems is revisited, and is resolved, which luckily happened last year by Cody Gonzalez and myself. And I have to stop here and apologize. It might be exciting to include yourself in a lecture on the history, but it's really very, very embarrassing. So I apologize, sincerely apologize, but I thought it fits the story nicely, and it's quite relevant, as we're going to see in a minute. So anyway, the point is, relying on the same concept of Prandtl, Kutta, Lanchester, the circulation theory of lift, that basically lift is due to circulation, we came up with this variational theory of lift that was published last year in the JFM. So the main contribution was to handle the problem of the arbitrariness of gamma. What gamma that nature selects, we relied on Hertz's principle of least curvature. It is the gamma that minimizes curvature, basically, all right? Luckily, we were very lucky that the reviewers, also acknowledged that, the reviewers were basically excited also, like this problem remained open for so long. So one of the reviewers says that it is surprising that such a basic question concerning a problem of fundamental importance had remained open for so long. another reviewer wrote something like, I find this paper to be notable progress on a classical problem that has not seen a fundamental step forward of this magnitude in quite some time. So they were appreciating that, yeah, okay, this is hey, oh, finally we have something, based on this classical work. The main contribution, like I mentioned, is that it addressed some of the concerns of the British school. Now gamma is no longer arbitrary, and the theory is not confined to sharp trailing edges, and is derived from first principles, so which is Hertz's principle of least curvature. So the interesting point is as follows. So we resolved these concerns not based on, a complex microscope or an expensive piece of equipment or an advanced computational algorithm that was not available to the pioneers. We just relied on a principle in analytical mechanics that were perfectly available to the pioneering names like Prandtl, Kutta, and yada, which raises the following question. What impact would the variational theory of lift have had on the Cambridge school if they had been presented with it? And I actually sent this question to the author, David Bloor, and he responded as follows. Such a situation could easily have arisen. All the pieces were in place. Yes, I mean, Hertz's principle was well before their time. And he added the following, which is quite interesting. Surely Glauert, as a deviant member of the Cambridge school, would have embraced your result with enthusiasm. It would have strengthened the stance he shared with the Prandtl school. More correctly and plausibly, your PMPG, this is the acronym of our result, would surely have had some impact on the old Cambridge determination to see a deep ontological divide between perfect fluids and real fluids. Added to which, there is your important point that the technique is grounded in the general and fundamental principles of mechanics, like coming from first principles. So the interesting point is as follows, which connects to Prandtl's work. This was an exercise in an engineering school motivated by an engineering application and actually engineering intuition. So it goes along the same lines. Not only that, so when you start with an engineering application, you might get something, for the fundamental theory. So if you want to solve any problem in ideal fluid dynamics, we know how to solve it. Here is Euler equation, right? So what we proved is that this is equivalent to minimizing curvature. So give me a problem in ideal fluid dynamics, I can solve it with Euler equation, I can solve it by minimizing curvature. This is basically a new principle in fluid physics. So starting with an engineering application, in many ways, sometimes you can get a general principle in the fundamental theory. And this is exactly what I wanted from this part, because this is what was written in Prandtl's lectures. In aviation, there lies a large field for the application of hydrodynamics of frictionless fluids. Look at this. Conversely, the practical problems of aviation have presented to the theory a large number of fruitful questions. He basically means, here is the theory, here is the application. The theory advances the application, and the application responds back by fundamental questions, advancing the theory even more. And this actually reminds me, of Edward McShane. He was an eminent mathematician in the 70s. He was giving a lecture on the history of calculus of variations. And people asked him the following question. Why Prandtl and the Russian mathematicians arrived at optimal control theory before the Americans, who were very good in calculus of variations? So he responded this way. In my mind, the great difference between the Russian approach and ours was in mental attitude. Prandtl and his students encountered some problems in engineering that urgently asked for answers. They answered the questions, and in the process, they incidentally introduced new and important ideas into the calculus of variations. I am regretful that when the questions arose, I did not notice them. Like most mathematicians in the United States, I was not paying attention to the problems of engineers. This also reminds me of the following, Levi-Civita fundamental theorem of Riemannian geometry. Go and Google this, all right? You will find this is the statement of the theorem. On any Riemannian manifold, there is a unique torsion-free metric affine connection. I know that nobody will get anything from this theory. Forget it. What I'm trying to say is, this is a theorem in pure math, pure geometry, right? Actually, a paper came out a few years ago by Urato. He showed the original proof of Levi-Civita. So look at this. This is a theorem, again, in pure math and pure geometry. And in the proof of any mathematical theorem, there is a main step, a corner step, a bottleneck, you know. So can you imagine, what is the main step, the bottleneck, in the proof of a theorem in pure math and pure geometry? It was actually the principle of virtual work, which is, you know, which is in the heart of analytical mechanics. If you add to this our recent result, which resolves the non-uniqueness of Euler equation, relying on a principle from analytical mechanics, then you get to appreciate very much Da Vinci's statement that mechanics is the paradise of the mathematical sciences, because by means of it, one comes to the fruits of mathematics. And I'm done. So if you have any question, I will be happy to take them.